Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Media Talks TV. I'm your host, Tony J. And if you're new here, hit the like, click the subscribe button, and hit the bell for more notifications because we got some more videos coming out. The last one was hot, and I'm glad about that. Want to thank y'all guys for watching my previous video. Um, Much appreciated. Today I really wanted to jump in to talk about the whole Keefe D situation. Um, you know, Tupac's murder has been really one of those long awaited resolutions. Um, I guess you could say the resolution of Tupac's murder is starting to really close in the gaps about the conspiracies around Tupac's death because you know for a long time people have speculated that Tupac's death was an orchestrated hit, which it was, but in some ways for our culture, Tupac's death has become kind of like the conspiracy that surrounded his death way before like 10, 20 years after his death. The conspiracies still hold, and even on social media the conspiracies still fly. And sometimes when we think about Tupac's death, we kind of created this mythology behind him, and kind of made Tupac Shakur kind of a mythical folk hero in a sense. What do I mean by folk hero? Well, here's a guy that comes out, has one of his first successful rap albums, goes on to do acting, acted in 3 movies, made a double album, and did all this way before he was taken away from us at the age of 25. And the amazing thing about Pac's life is he is, when he was alive, he was demonized, but in death, he's become this centerpiece for hip hop as being one of the greatest rappers of all time. Just like with rock and roll, people put Elvis as the centerpiece. Like everybody white talks about Elvis. Oh, Elvis was the king of rock and roll, and so on and so on. And out of all of that, and out of his death, people in Vegas and Las Vegas start to impersonate him. And it's a funny thing about Las Vegas because Las Vegas, you know, we there was a time when Las Vegas was a mob city, and some of the people that ran Las Vegas was the mob. So for his death to have happened in Las Vegas, it it was kind of creepy in a sense because you know Las Vegas is one of those cities that that was tightly controlled by the mob. Even the cops couldn't touch none of the casinos that these mobsters had ran. And sometimes the cops got paid off to turn and look the other way. Cops was on the payroll at these casinos. But to get back to the main point, Pac's death makes Las Vegas a very dangerous place to live. And even then, people had said that there was a certain level of corruption in Las Vegas. But there's no bigger city that has more police corruption than in Los Angeles. And that goes to bring me back to the other point about these deaths and how, Biggie and Tupac's deaths are really interconnected with this whole thing with Keefe D and why Keefe D is ending up in the situation that he's ending up now, why it took so fucking long for him to be arrested. You know, everybody knows about Los Angeles, the gangs, the corrupt cops, the crack epidemic. Los Angeles is known to be a very corrupt city, but it was always corrupt going all the way back to the days of Mickey Cohen. And when you talk about the police surrounding the death of Biggie at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles, even then, you know, the Rampart scandal had taken root, and people knew that there were corrupt cops on the force being paid and also intertwined with the gangs, especially the Crips. And I think what really put Biggie and Tupac in the crosshairs of their death, they would still be here if it wasn't for the media. And I say that very plainly because the media hyped up the whole East Coast West Coast rap beef, and it ties in with why their demise was so swift. Media, like I've said time and time again, when I was younger, I learned about how tabloids can destroy people's lives, how magazines, how things would happen to people, how conspiracies would be created through the media. And the main point that I want to get to in all of this is that when the whole disagreement happened between Biggie and Tupac, magazines and media outlets sought to exploit that because there was a need to get in to see the seedy world of the record industry. Vibe magazine, remember, Vibe magazine is a magazine that's under Quincy Jones. And there was an article, there was that infamous East versus West um thing with, Biggie on the top, Suge and Tupac on the bottom. And when people read about this disagreement between two men, a lot of other things fed into it. Their deaths, if there weren't too many people involved, their demise wouldn't have been so swift the way it was. The whole Vibe magazine article, the back and forth at the Source Awards in 1995. And then by that time, the disc records hit him up. All of that kind of culminated into it being entertainment, but also understanding that because they were in an industry where they created these personas of a gangster rapper and a revolutionary, their personas played into that narrative, and then the media took their imagery and who they were and then tried to extrapolate it and exploit it at the same time. You know, I was only a child when gangster rap started to take off the way that it did. I remember when I was 5, 6 years old, I remember Biggie, One More Chance, and hearing the remixes on the radio, how a lot of people listen to Biggie Smalls. And I also remember um, West Coast rap being played on the radio. I remember when I Got Five on it came out when I was younger. I was only like 5, 6 years old. The thing I'm starting to understand about the rap world as it relates to Biggie and Tupac is that with so much going on with rap music, there's this tendency that if you put something out into the world, people are going to gravitate towards the negative aspects of that. Tupac has said in many interviews he wasn't a gangster, and the only reason he never made gangster rap music, he only made revolutionary music that helped people rise up. Um, but sometimes when you think about the music that Tupac put out, there was a difference between, you listen to some of his albums. My favorite Tupac album will always be Me Against the World. It's just something about that whole entire album that really kind of pieces together who Tupac really is and how really conflicting he is with himself. The last two albums, everybody says All Eyes on Me is the greatest album. Killuminati, Machiavelli, those last two albums were his best albums. Everybody says that. But there was no other album. There was no other album that really described who Pac really was except Me Against the World. Because it shows the conflicting ideas of who Tupac was. And I think and I truly believe that if Pac had not got caught up with Suge Knight and Death Row Records, I think he would still be around today. But because he got caught up in the madness of who Suge Knight was, because Suge Knight, if we study who Suge Knight really was, he was a hardcore gang member. He was Ma Paru. And the fact that you look at the pictures of where Pac is kind of putting a red bandana on, He has, one picture where he's throwing up gang signs at the media and spitting at the media because the media had constantly tried to redefine who he was. They demonized him while he was alive, but they didn't truly want to get the ideas and the understanding of who he really was. And Tupac was really a mythical character in a sense, kind of like on the same level as Michael Jackson. You know, Michael Jackson wanted to look mysterious in the media. He wanted to be, and he had thing about Michael Jackson as compared to Tupac, he had this mythology about him. Michael wanted to be a mythological hero, and he played with the media. The media constantly redefined who he really was. And then he got the label Wacko Jacko towards the end of his decline, because his decline started after right around 2003. Um, After the second allegation of child molestation came out. But what made Michael Jackson such a interesting person was he would play with the media. He would create these characters, and these characters would be a part of his persona. And then when he got tired and he couldn't put the persona away, his persona became meshed with his personality. And that's the dangerous thing about being a celebrity in the United States, especially in America. Michael Jackson played around with the idea of being a spectacle. And that's exactly what Tupac was trying to do. And, Tupac comes from theater, right? So maybe in his mind, he created the gangster spectacle because that's what the media was interested in him every time they looked at him. After the shooting at Quad Studios, after he had went to jail and then came out on sexual battery, he became the gangster. Before that, he was the revolutionary. Before that, he was thug life. But then once he came out of prison, he took on the gangster image and the gangster persona. And like I said, there was the infamous video where he's coming out of a courtroom and he's leaning out the window, putting up the West Coast sign with a bad bandana and Ma Paru, trying to rep Ma Paru, and he's spitting at the cameras and spitting at the media's most infamous image before his death. And maybe in some ways he was acting, but then when he started taking on that image, and sometimes people have alter egos. We all have alter egos that we try to fit into, that might have put him in a position to where he lost his life when he tried to act like a gangster. And trying to act like a gangster, he ended up getting shot by some real gangsters. And this was one of the issues I also had with, what's so interesting. I've even studied Biggie Smalls, and I've listened to a lot of Biggie Smalls um music. And the one thing I noticed about Biggie, as in contrast to Tupac, is Biggie liked to portray himself as a mob boss. He had this affinity for the mafia. That's why he called his clique Junior Mafia, which is weird and interesting at the same time. Like you trying to be John Gotti, you're trying to be, you know, all these Italian gangsters, but you yourself are not Italian. But he created this mythical image, and then he talked about the issue of death. And one of the things, like I said, with the rap game that I don't like is when people try to portray themselves as something that they're not. When you think about the street elements of these two individuals, Biggie was completely from the streets. Pac, not so much. Pac acted like he was from the streets, but he really wasn't from the streets. A lot of people would like to believe that, but he wasn't. And that's what's so interesting about, you know, learning about Tupac and learning about Biggie and understanding why their deaths were very significant in hip hop music. And as time goes on, we see the same exact things. You know, people creating these personas, and their personas become their alter egos. But as it pertains to Keefe D, I've seen multiple interviews. I even watched a 2 hour interview with Vlad TV where he talks about being in the white Cadillac with Orlando Anderson. And I could tell you it was in some ways, when you heard Keefe D talk, there was the sense of a kind of a Freudian slip in a sense. And I'm like, this guy had everything to do with the killing of Tupac, directly or indirectly. When you think about, murders and assassinations and hits, this had to have been an orchestrated hit brought on by a fight at the MGM Grand as they were leaving. And I think, in some ways, to be completely honest, Keefe D has become kind of like the Jack Ruby of hip hop. You know, if you don't really understand who Jack Ruby was and how important he was to the Kennedy assassination, um, when they talked about Jack Ruby, everybody thought Jack Ruby had a direct tie to Kennedy's assassination, that he was the one that orchestrated everything. And then, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald took the shot. But, there was also, even in the 60s, a conspiracy to where Jack Ruby was kind of the orchestrator of the Kennedy assassination. And even his name was also brought up in the Warren Commission. Um, what's so interesting about that is that, when you think about Jack Ruby was a nightclub owner and had connections with Momo Giacana in Chicago. And the tie-ins with that one person kind of meanders itself, and people get an understanding of why Kennedy was assassinated. This kind of spells it out for us who Keefe D is. Keefe D is the Jack Ruby of the Tupac assassination. This was an assassination. It's no different. I mean, what makes it different is that Tupac was a celebrity. And when you have important figureheads being taken out, it's an assassination. It wasn't he was murdered. It was an orchestrated hit. And even the way that Keefe D explained it, it made it seem as he was the co-conspirator or the conspirator that killed Tupac when he was in the car that night. And there's going to be a lot of eye-opening things in this case that kind of tie everything together to really piece together how this whole conspiracy went unnoticed, because everybody in the media and especially in social media have said, oh well, Tupac's still alive, or Tupac, he orchestrated his own death so that he doesn't have to keep continuing to be in the limelight. He wanted to get away from everything. And Tupac's still alive. I saw him here. They have all these mythologies, and Afeni Shakur had to live with the conspiracy of her son's death, which was even more tragic. She's no longer alive to get the justice that she truly deserved. And what's so sad about it is that even today, that mythology continues. It's kind of like, Tupac's death has been wrote about in books. I remember reading one book, and if you ever get a chance to get it, it's a very good book. It's called Once Upon a Time in Compton. I read that book, and it talks about what was going on with Biggie and Tupac's murder and how the cops were there. And then, of course, there are other books that were written where people were there that night when Biggie was killed, and there that night when Tupac was shot. But Keefe D also exploited his involvement with the whole Tupac thing, and has said in numerous interviews, even going back to the whole Death Row Chronicles documentary that aired on BET, where he told people that, yeah, he was there in the car that night. He kept talking and talking and talking. And when things kind of slipped out, you started to notice that this guy knows more than what he puts on. And it's become abundantly clear. And the cops literally caught on to it, even though they could have caught on to this shit a long time ago and could have, you know, really killed the whole conspiracy and put it to rest. But, we're not going to know much about this whole Keefe D situation until, more things open up in the trial and the pre-trial and the civil and the proceeding. We're going to learn more about this whole ordeal, you know, and I feel as though it's going to be a long time before we get to an understanding of what was the cause, because there's a whole lot of pieces that need to be put together. One being how the Crips knew that Tupac was going to be at the MGM Grand. That's one of the things I think that's going to be a bigger piece of understanding. And then also understanding who Orlando Anderson was, Baby Lane, Crip, I believe, and who they were, and what was the reason Keefe D had been there, or they knew about the whereabouts, or whether or not Suge Knight was directly also involved in this because remember, he's Mob Paru. And I was saying, like, in LA, gangs and cops are very interconnected with each other. This goes all the way back to the Rampart scandal and Rafael Perez and all the other things that kind of bleed into what's going on. Because there was a whole lot of co-conspirators that were involved that had their hand, especially in the music industry. Remember cops. Remember one thing about cops is cops moonlight. Cops get paid under the table. They moonlight and they do things where, unfortunately, they get tied up in that gang life as well. That's why these gangs continue to control and have organized crime. They these criminal organizations and how they're tied in with the LAPD, which is one of the primary reasons why we couldn't get any answers to Biggie's killing. And I don't think we ever will get any answers. I think that case is going to go cold because Russell Poole's on that case, and I think that case is not going to get solved. It's just not. I hate to say it, but just be thankful that the Tupac case got solved. If the Biggie one gets solved, I mean, you gotta pray for that one, I believe, because LA is a different beast in of itself. LA is not Las Vegas. Las Vegas, despite its control through the mob, they kind of cleaned up their act. But LA continues to be very corrupt in terms of their cops and their police officers. They're tied in with the gangs. They're tied in with the Bloods and the Crips. And unfortunately, they have to be because they have to have that intel. They have to have that intel on the street in order to understand what's going on. And that's what's so crazy with Pac's murder. What I will never understand is even after Tupac's murder, why would Biggie go to Los Angeles after the fact? And why his security team wasn't watching him at all times? Somebody within inside of that organization probably knew what was going on and chose not to protect Biggie. But I feel as though Pac's murder has become kind of like similar to the Warren Commission. And anybody that's a very big studier or somebody that's a hobbyist that has studied the Kennedy assassinations, there's a lot that kind of goes into it. There's so many documentaries and movies that have been made about the Kennedys and the Kennedy assassination. Who was involved? Was there a co-conspirator? Was there mob connections tied to it? Was Frank Sinatra involved directly or indirectly? Because Frank Sinatra and Jack Kennedy were both friends and all this other shit. It kind of arouses the information that is being brought out. People love information. People love conspiracy theories. Somebody called me a conspiracy theorist at one point, and I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I'm a hobbyist, somebody that likes to study history. I'm a history buff. I also like reading books and information about certain things. I've read a book about the Dulles brothers, who were the head of the CIA, basically the father of the CIA. What's so interesting about these cases is that there's so much information in case files on these things that people could easily look this shit up. but choose not to. The information is right in front of your face, but it takes somebody to do investigative work to actually piece together what actually happened. And I always used to like A&E documentaries and stuff like that. Documentaries that would come on A&E, and Biography Channel, and they would make these documentaries where people were actually going to other places, you know, when they did a documentary on the Kennedy assassination, they was like, okay, well, this happened at the Daily Plaza. The car pulled up. Somebody was on a grassy knolls, and the shot came this way. And the angle, I always used to like those types of documentaries. And then they would say, they interview these secret witnesses, and they was like, oh, I was on a grassy knoll that day, and I remember there was somebody behind the fence shooting a revolver at President Kennedy, and I always like those documentaries. There's millions of documentaries out there about the Kennedy assassination. And I also like Oliver Stone. I always love Oliver Stone's movies because he talks about the Warren Commission and Kennedy, and how the Warren Commission came together and who had to investigate Kennedy's assassination. But to get back to the whole thing with Tupac, there was a lot of shit going on even back then with the music. And feel as though I feel as though if Pac hadn't got caught up with Suge Knight and got caught in that gang world, because LA is a gang, LA is a gang world, and Pac was not from LA. He's from the Bay Area. He's from the Bay, Marin County. So for him to be going to LA and getting involved with a man like Suge Knight, knowing his reputation, was just sad because he was looking for a way out of prison. He probably would have been more safer in prison than out. That's what I honestly believe. But it goes to show you, you know, in hindsight, you had to watch the company that you keep. You have to watch the surroundings and people who you're around if you're getting to a place where you become high profile. Because Pac was high profile, he had too many people around him. He had a large entourage of people. That's what really put an end to his his music career as well as his acting career. And it should have never happened. Well, that's it for this broadcast of Media Talks TV, this episode of Media Talks. I thank you for watching this broadcast. This is your host, Tony J. And if you're new here, welcome and subscribe. I'm out.